Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live broadcast, Efficient Cold Sample Storage, Reducing the Environmental Footprint and Financial Impact of Freezer Use in Research. I'm Christy Jewell of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is brought to you by LabRoots and sponsored by Brooks Life Sciences. For more information on our sponsor, click on the sponsor logo at the left side of your screen or visit brookslifesciences.com. Now let's get started. I would like to remind everyone that today's event is interactive, and we encourage you to participate by submitting as many questions as you want at any time you want during the presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. Also, please notice that you can share this webinar on your personal social media. Just click on the Social Sharing tab on the left to let your friends and colleagues know about today's live event. Now, if you have any trouble seeing or hearing today's presentation, click on that support tab found at the top right of your presentation window, or just use that Ask a Question box to let us know you're experiencing a problem. This presentation is educational and thus offers continuing education credits. Please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located at the top right of the presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. We have two presenters for you today. Dr. Kathryn Ramirez-Aguilar, CU Green Labs Program Manager, University of Colorado Boulder, and Board of Directors, International Institute for Sustainable Laboratories. Also joining us is Christina Greever, Operations Manager for My Green Lab. For complete biographies on our speakers, please visit the Biography tab at the top of your screen. Welcome, Kathy and Christina. You may now begin your presentations.
Thank you for that introduction, Christy. My name is Kathy, and as Christy mentioned, I manage the University of Colorado Green Labs program, and I'm also on the board for the International Institute for Sustainable Labs. It is great to be with you here today to talk about efficient cold storage. You know, it wasn't long after starting the CU Green Labs program just over 10 years ago that I was lucky to partner with a few other colleagues at other U.S. universities that had also started Green Labs programs at their institutions. In those early days of Green Lab efforts, efficient cold storage was a natural fit for us to focus on for energy efficiency in labs. 10 years later, the CU Green Labs program continues to work on energy efficiency with laboratory freezers, among many other efforts at CU Boulder, such as those that focus on water efficiency in labs, recycling of materials leaving the lab, and also two of my favorite areas of focus, which are enhancing the sharing of research equipment and efficient use of laboratory space, because efforts on these two topics can have such large positive impacts for avoided costs and also large positive impacts for reducing the footprint of research on the environment. The place where the Green Labs community has been connecting with each other and sharing our efforts with each other, including efficient cold storage, is the International Institute for Sustainable Laboratories, which will be holding its 2020 conference in Chicago in October. Among many other stakeholders, including engineers, planners, and designers who will be involved with creating energy-efficient laboratory buildings, are people like Christina and I working to engage scientists in efficiency actions in laboratories, as well as research equipment manufacturers showcasing their energy-efficient research equipment, including cold storage units, such as energy-efficient ultra-low temperature freezers. So now I'll pass it over to Christina.
Thanks, Kathy. So my name is Christina. Thanks again for listening in to our webinar today. I am the Operations Manager for the lab sustainability nonprofit My Green Lab. Our mission is to build a culture of sustainability through science, and we do this through a variety of programs, one of which is the Freezer Challenge. Our lab certification program, which is available to labs worldwide, complements the Freezer Challenge because it also promotes these same cold storage best practices, but also covers many other topics related to sustainability in research, such as energy use, water use, waste reduction, green chemistry, fume hoods, autoclaves, travel, and even purchasing. After the Freezer Challenge, it is a logical next step for labs that want to examine their protocols and practices to be more sustainable. Another one of our program areas I want to mention is the Center for Energy Efficient Laboratories, or CEAL. This is a partnership between us, Kilowatt Engineering, and Frontier Energy that works on gathering data and conducting market studies to get the information that the lab sustainability community needs to advance our field. I'm going to be referring to this again later. So My Green Lab collaborates with suppliers, academics, and industry groups to develop and share laboratory sustainability best practices. We listen to feedback from our partners to drive continuous improvement in the lab sustainability field, and we also innovate new ways to engage this community. Finally, I just want to mention that before I worked for My Green Lab, I worked for the Green Labs program at CU Boulder with Kathy. So if it appears in this webinar that I have an intimate knowledge of what CU Boulder does, it is because I do, and I used to work there. So just wanted to clarify that relationship. In the next few minutes, we're going to discuss the impact of cold storage on our planet, and then I'll jump into the International Laboratory Freezer Challenge and explain how that works. Then we'll move into the best practices promoted by the challenge. Finally, Kathy will take us on a deeper dive into the broader impacts of efficient cold storage. So why should we as scientists think about our cold storage anyway? Well, not only do laboratories have a significant energy footprint worldwide, but our cold storage does too. Refrigerators and freezers are very common types of laboratory equipment found in most labs. In 2016, the Center for Energy Efficient Laboratories, or CEAL, put out a market assessment which surveyed the number of refrigerators and freezers across California. There are about 3 ultra-low temperature freezers per lab in California, which equates to 58,000 total in that state. That means that there are at least 440,000 ultra-low temperature freezers in the United States, and that is just the low end of the estimated range. One ultra-low temperature freezer alone can consume 10 to 30 kilowatt hours per day, depending on whether it is energy efficient or not. For perspective, a small single-family home in the United States consumes about 25 kilowatt hours per day. So the magnitude of the impact of cold storage in the United States alone is pretty incredible, let alone thinking about this on a worldwide scale. The CEAL market assessment estimated that there's a minimum of 440,000 ultra-lows in the U.S. with a maximum estimate of 890,000 of them. Regardless of how you look at the data, we're talking about between 1 and 2 Hoover dams worth of electricity a year. That's how much ultra-low temperature freezers are consuming in the United States alone. This doesn't even include the energy use of refrigerators, minus 20-degree freezers, cold rooms, etc. If laboratories worldwide made a conscious effort to improve the energy efficiency of their cold storage in whatever way they could, this could have a measurable positive impact on our planet. And this is exactly what the International Laboratory Freezer Challenge is trying to do. So the Freezer Challenge has now gone global, but it was actually started on a smaller scale as a competition between UC Davis, CU Boulder, and a couple other institutions that all provided input as Kathy Ramirez-Aguilar and her colleague Alan Doyle worked out how a competition like this could work and what it would cover. This was quite a few years ago. The Freezer Challenge was handed off to I2SL and My Green Lab in 2017. So we are now in the 4th year of this broader challenge. It's free to participate, open to any lab worldwide, and is supported by corporate sponsors that manufacture refrigerators and freezers. It might surprise you to know that greater energy efficiency isn't the whole point of the Freezer Challenge. The best practices we promote also benefit sample accessibility, improved sample integrity, and can reduce costs for your lab and your institution. So it's a win-win scenario for labs that take the time to compete in this challenge. A wide variety of laboratories participate in the Freezer Challenge each year. We have academic labs, government labs, pharmaceutical and biotech labs, as well as clinical labs that participate. So far, we have over 192 laboratories participating this year. And we do know that the Freezer Challenge is having positive impact. In 2019, the actions of all the laboratories participating in the challenge combined save 2.4 million kilowatt hours per year, which is the equivalent of 360 passenger vehicles driven for a year, or the energy use of 263 single-family homes in the United States. Imagine what the impact could be if thousands of labs did the freezer challenge. Another impact of the freezer challenge is engaging laboratories to take sustainable action, sometimes for the very first time. Pictured here are some of the labs and institutions that won the freezer challenge in 2019. At the top, you have the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, who won the academic category last year. Charles River won the biopharma organizational category, and the CDC won for the government category. Awards are also given to the top individual labs in each category that take the most actions during the freezer challenge. So we have the organizational award level and then the individual lab award level. The Multiple Sclerosis and Parkinson's Tissue Bank at the Imperial College London took the top academic prize last year. They're pictured on the left. Pictured at the bottom in the lab coats is the Automated Strain Engineering Lab at Ramirez, who won the biopharma industry category. And on the right is the Inorganic and Radiation Analytical Toxicology branch of the Centers for Disease Control. They were the top lab in the government category. So participating in the freezer challenge is very straightforward. A lab can register anytime between October and May, and score sheets are usually due by May 1st each year. It's quick and easy to register, and then the lab receives a score sheet that they can work through at their leisure over a period of weeks or months. An organization can also have a site coordinator if they want, and this is especially beneficial if a university or a company wants to hold an internal competition and wants to know who at their site has registered for the challenge. As labs work through the freezer challenge score sheet, they are actively implementing the best practices I'm about to walk you through on this webinar. The lab then submits their completed score sheet back to My Green Lab by the deadline, and we calculate scores and the impact of their actions. Finally, the top labs and organizations in each category get their photo and recognition in the journal Nature. Labs and organizational winners are also honored at the Go Beyond Awards lunch at the annual International Institute for Sustainable Labs conference, which is taking place in Chicago this year. So, the freezer challenge can be useful to any lab that has any one of these types of cold storage: ultra-low temperature freezers, -20 to -40 degrees Celsius units, refrigerators, cold rooms, ultra-low freezers, as well as liquid nitrogen storage. The best practices highlighted by the challenge fall into 4 categories: good management practices, temperature tuning, retirements and upgrades, and cutting-edge practices. So there's something for any lab that has cold storage as a part of this challenge. So let's get into those best practices now. First of all, to be clear, this photo here depicts what you don't want to be striving for. Look at all of that ice. This freezer has clearly not been defrosted in a while. The boxes can barely fit on the shelves. You don't want your freezer to get to this point, obviously. It's important to periodically defrost freezers, whether that be on a schedule set by the lab, such as every year, or when you start to see ice build up. Don't wait for it to get this bad. Other important preventative maintenance is to remove dust from the intake areas of your cold storage units and gently vacuum the cooling coils underneath. Finally, as often as necessary, gently tap ice from around your door seal and brush ice off of the inner doors. Be very gentle so you don't damage the door seal of your freezer. These are very expensive to replace. This next set of best practices are all related to the samples that you store inside your cold storage units. Be sure to do periodic sample cleanouts. Every 6 months or every year is a great idea. Have an inventory system, whichever method works for your lab, but then stick to it. Update your inventory as needed. If you have cold storage units with a lot of empty space, try consolidating your units down so that you can unplug or retire a newly empty unit. By consolidating your samples, this will actually allow your freezer to run more efficiently, and your door openings will have less impact. All the cold air won't be falling out of your freezer. Finally, if your samples allow it, convert from standard 10 by 10 freezer boxes to higher density formats. So what's the why behind these best practices? Ensuring your freezers are periodically defrosted and consistently de-iced means that your freezer will have the proper internal airflow that was intended by its design. Ice can get in the way of this. Furthermore, your door should close properly if you keep the ice away, and your door should not leak any cold air. Proper internal airflow will ensure that there is greater temperature uniformity in your cold storage unit, which improves sample integrity for the long term. Your freezer won't have to work as hard when there is proper airflow too. A heavily iced over freezer can consume more energy than normal, so defrosting is also beneficial for energy efficiency. Removing dust from intake areas and coils also positively impacts the efficiency of your unit. Consider this: for every minute an ultra-low temperature freezer that is in an upright model, so an upright ultra-low, every minute that freezer door is open, it takes 10 minutes for the freezer to get back to its set point. The longer the door is kept open, the harder your compressors or engine must work to cool your freezer back down. This impacts energy consumption of your unit, but also affects sample integrity. Without an effective inventory, you are exposing your samples to more temperature fluctuations over their lifetime. Keeping an inventory will keep your unit's internal temperature more stable and reduce the energy consumption of your unit and protect your samples. By doing periodic sample cleanouts, you're freeing up new space for the storage of newer samples in your freezers as well. This reduces the chance that your lab will need to purchase additional cold storage units, which impacts the long-term energy use of your laboratory. Buying a new cold storage unit should be a critical decision. You're buying a piece of equipment that will be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year until it fails. That could be 15, 20, or even 25 years down the line. And finally, higher density storage is the best practice for the same reason sample cleanouts are. Reduce the need for more cold storage, reduce costs for your lab and institution at the same time. So in the category of temperature tuning, there are two main best practices. First, consider whether you're storing your samples at the appropriate temperature. This best practice asks that scientists consider whether, for example, items stored in their ultra-low could instead be kept at -20 Celsius, or whether items in a -20 freezer could be safely stored in a refrigerator. Particularly since ultra-low temperature freezers are larger energy consumers than -20 units or refrigerators, ensuring that you're being realistic and selective about what should be kept at -70 or -80 degrees Celsius is beneficial. The second best practice is chilling up ultra-low temperature freezers to -70. This practice has grown common at CU Boulder, with 50% of ultra-low temperature freezers on campus at a set point of -70 degrees Celsius. How this started at Boulder was that a scientist had a freezer that wouldn't maintain -80 Celsius anymore. A technician was called out, and the technician determined there really wasn't anything that they could do for the freezer. But he suggested that the lab could put their freezer at -70 degrees Celsius instead, and they might get a few more months out of it. So the lab did that, and it worked. When CU Green Labs found out about this instance that happened, they looked around campus for other freezers that were kept at -70. Sure enough, they located about 5 more freezers that had always been kept at -70 Celsius. And so they started to promote this as an energy-saving freezer resiliency method. Kathy's colleagues at UC Davis also had freezers on campus that were kept at -70, so Boulder wasn't the only one doing this. A few years ago, CU Boulder started a database where scientists could record what sort of samples they're storing at -70 and for what length of time. This database is available to the Green Labs community, and we've linked to it in the resource section of this webinar, which is over on the left-hand side of your screen. There's a whole resources tab with a bunch of links. So this data is from a 2016 market assessment of ultra-low temperature freezers done by the Center for Energy Efficient Laboratories. It shows that for 15 different makes and models of ultra-low temperature freezer, there is on average a 37% reduction in energy use when the set point is at -70 instead of -80. Therefore, there are energy efficiency benefits to both of the best practices in this category. A freezer's compressors don't have to work as hard at -70 Celsius as they do at -80 degrees Celsius, especially with frequent door openings. This means less wear on the mechanical components and less stress on the freezer. Keeping your freezer at -70 can extend the life of your freezer and reduce the risk of catastrophic failure. Right. If you do a great job with a sample cleanout or consolidate samples from multiple units into a single fuller unit, you might have the opportunity to retire a cold storage unit you no longer need. Either turn off the unneeded unit until you need it again, or if you need it in an emergency, or you can permanently dispose of it. When choosing which unit to dispose of, try and eliminate the most energy consumptive units first. When considering whether to buy a new cold storage unit, be sure to take a look at ENERGY STAR rated lab refrigerators and freezers. These have been vetted extensively through the ENERGY STAR process, and there are lots of great options. By making an energy efficient choice when you buy, you're likely saving your institution or company thousands of dollars over the lifetime of the equipment. The most sure way to reduce costs regarding your cold storage is to unplug unneeded units and permanently dispose of them as possible. If you reduce empty space in your units too by consolidation, this will actually promote better airflow and temperature uniformity throughout the unit. If you're considering buying a new unit, be sure you're buying an energy efficient model for the long-term energy and cost savings for your organization. The final category of best practices is what we call cutting edge ideas. Share space with other colleagues in your cold storage units, either permanently or in the event of an emergency. Create barcoded inventories for greater labeling accuracy and for ease of sample access. Or try room temperature sample storage. By sharing your cold storage space with nearby colleagues, even those from other laboratories, you generate goodwill, but also sharing can lead to significant cost avoidance and greater energy efficiency among your labs. Kathy is going to talk in greater detail about this with an example from CU Boulder. Barcoded inventories can lead to better sample accessibility and tracking. Finally, room temperature sample storage has the potential to make your lab more resilient and reduce risk that is inherent with storing samples in freezers long term, which obviously rely on a constant power supply. By storing at room temperature, this option is definitely more energy efficient. It requires zero energy input. My Green Lab has information on our website about room temperature sample storage, as does CU Green Labs. Room temperature sample storage technology is based on natural processes, such as how tardigrades and brine shrimp, which are extremophiles, are able to protect their DNA, RNA, proteins, membranes, and cellular systems long-term in a dried state, and later are revived by simple rehydration. The technology works by forming a thermostable barrier during the drying process to protect samples from degradation during storage at room temperature. Thus far, room temperature sample storage seems like a viable solution for the long-term storage of DNA, RNA, and bacteria. And there are also a lot of resources and references you can look into for doing room temperature sample storage and trying that at your institution. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Kathy.
Thanks, Christina. The efforts that Christina has been talking about for efficiency in cold storage also mean efficiency with the funding that scientists spend on research within labs, also known as direct costs. For example, a good inventory of lab freezers and refrigerators means saving researcher time because it is easier to find samples and materials, and it also means avoiding duplicate orders of materials or costly specialized items because lab members can see what the lab has on hand and where to find it. Researcher time and lab materials are both direct costs. As Christina pointed out, cleanouts and other ways to use freezer space more efficiently, such as dense storage, means less of a need for labs to buy additional freezers and other cold storage units, again, as savings for direct costs. Furthermore, these efforts for efficiency with cold storage in the freezer challenge also mean efficiency with overhead resources and therefore overhead costs that companies or research institutions are paying for in support of research and that granting agencies are contributing to on top of direct costs for overhead costs at institutions, also known as indirect costs. For example, actions for energy efficiency, such as those that Christina discussed, means the use of less electricity and thus also minimization of ventilation required to address rejected heat into the lab space by freezers and other cold storage units. These are overhead costs that are reduced. Additionally, efficient use of space inside freezers and other cold storage units means minimizing the need for more freezers and more units, which takes up lab space. Lab space is thus an overhead resource that is used more efficiently. And when we're talking about using laboratory space more efficiently, that can lead to large cost avoidance because constructing new laboratory space and new laboratory buildings is incredibly expensive. At CU Boulder, for example, 1,000 square feet of new wet lab space will cost approximately $1 million in a new lab building construction project. So any effort that contributes towards efficient use of laboratory space and keeping lab space focused on research is in the best interest of everyone. More efficient use of lab space means less pressure to build more lab buildings or additions onto lab buildings. Also, wet lab space is typically very energy-intense space, especially because of ventilation requirements. Therefore, minimizing the need for more lab space also greatly benefits energy savings. At the same time, minimizing the need for more cold storage units in wet lab space also means helping to keep lab space focused on meeting the needs of researchers by keeping lab space focused on research and contributing to the goal of helping to make sure researchers have the space that they need for their experiments. Which leads me to the question, is wet lab space really the best place for freezers? Or are there other spaces that could be used instead to house freezers and thus help maximize the use of lab space to meet research needs while also being more cost-effective and efficient? In my opinion, the freezer challenge is a great way to engage scientists to think about actions that they can take for efficient, effective cold storage, which then opens the doors to even more conversation for even larger action. Because of efforts such as the Freezer Challenge and Green Labs programs, there is growing awareness and growing action by scientists to minimize research's footprint on the planet. I've been impressed with the actions that lab members are willing to take at CU Boulder and beyond because they want to do their part in minimizing that footprint. As Christina mentioned earlier, those campuses with a site coordinator in the Freezer Challenge tend to have the most success in the Freezer Challenge. Overall, these efforts with the Freezer Challenge open the doors to begin thinking about changes and actions that can take place beyond the actions promoted by the Freezer Challenge. For example, the benefits that can come from co-localization of freezers in equipment rooms or even in freezer farms. Over the years, I've been learning from colleagues in facilities management at CU Boulder that when co-localization of cold storage units is possible, cooling needs to address rejected heat from the units can be addressed in a much more localized, energy-efficient manner. Furthermore, campus resources for backup power for times of emergency can be focused in on select locations, thus enabling a campus to more strategically use funding for backup infrastructure and therefore be able to stretch funding for infrastructure to serve more backup power needs. In an emergency, because freezers hold critical research samples, the thought is that these co-localized spaces can be more easily prioritized for support, which benefits resilience for cold storage samples and research. Adding a manager to oversee the co-localized cold storage units opens the doors to even more opportunity for benefits and efficiency. Now it's possible for cold storage to be a service to researchers. There is designated personnel to make sure that units are well cared for and monitored, to provide support, to assure good labeling and inventorying of samples, to respond in the time of an emergency with an emergency action plan in place. I'm sure no researcher will miss the worry of a 2 a.m. weekend phone call about a freezer failing. It can also mean enabling easy access to freezer space when a lab doesn't need or want to purchase an entire ultra-low temperature freezer, because they can rent the space that they actually need. This benefits efficient use of space inside freezers and thus efficient use of floor space. Where managed co-localized cold storage is possible to implement at a company or research institution, in my opinion, it's unlikely that there's going to be one solution that fits all, and thus there is likely a need for flexibility in solutions, so the need of each unique campus can be best met. For example, could there be a more centralized facility for archival samples on the edge of campus, or more regional or local spaces with freezers to meet the needs of samples that would be accessed more frequently by researchers? In this scenario, when I say a regional space, I'm suggesting one building with a freezer farm near a number of other research buildings that can be accessed by those buildings, or for samples that are accessed even more frequently, a more localized setup could be within a common equipment room within a research building itself. Or could there be a centralized facility to serve both archival samples and samples that need to be accessed more frequently, with the ability to quickly get samples delivered from the facility when needed? I was lucky a number of years ago to visit an example of this latter idea at the University of Minnesota. There was a freezer farm that was on the edge of campus, and it was serving one or more biological departments. And so this was an interesting example to visit. I would expect there are many examples of different models out there on other campuses or at companies that we could all learn from. In fact, I bet there are groups focused on biorepository work, or companies like Brooks Life Sciences that is sponsoring this talk that likely know a lot about this subject and the cost avoidances involved. For many campuses, a move to co-localization of units requires a shift in culture, and I would expect likely an even larger shift in culture to move in the direction of co-localization of units with a manager where scientists rent space in freezers. Cultural changes, in my experience, often take significant time unless there is another factor, such as a sudden event that causes the shift quickly, like a response to a natural disaster that will keep power out on a campus for an extended period of time. NYU in New York City experienced such a disaster during Hurricane Sandy that required an immediate response to save research samples. At CU Boulder, our culture is still very much where individual labs have their own individual cold storage units. But with encouragement, that culture is being shifted over time. Efforts by our facilities management to include equipment rooms and lab building projects where heat producing equipment can be placed instead of inside the lab, these are having positive impacts. Also, CU Green Labs has been promoting a shift towards shared research equipment with a manager for the benefit of efficiency, but also for the benefit of researchers and for campus. Together, because of the efforts of many, and because of our great engaged scientists, culture is shifting on my campus, in my opinion. CU Green Labs often highlights with researchers and other campus stakeholders all the different benefits that managed equipment sharing brings from many different perspectives. In fact, we have a list of 16 reasons on our website, most of which have nothing to do with energy savings or the environment. And a link has been provided to this webpage in the resources provided for this webinar, which have been told is to the left. There is growing support among CU Boulder campus researchers for migrating towards more and more managed shared research equipment on campus, which can benefit, for example, expanded research capability and avoided costs for scientists. In fact, our campus has just hired a director of cores and shared instrumentation. Also, space allocation principles on my campus include sharing of research equipment resources and is being promoted as part of laboratory construction projects and renovations. And even in buildings where there's no construction projects being implemented, efforts such as the formation of the BioCore, which is focused on enhancing sharing of existing research equipment resources between labs and between 3 departments on campus, is having great success. At the same web page on shared equipment that I just mentioned, there's also a button link to report on the progress of the BioCore during just its first year. There's also a link to a biochemistry shared cell culture facility case study that Christina worked so hard to put together that is another useful resource that demonstrates the benefits to science and the large potential for cost avoidance that exists on campuses for managed sharing of equipment like biosafety cabinets, incubators, cold storage units, or in the case of the BioCore, nanodrops, shakers, and so much more. Items, really, these are items that are outside the super expensive category of research equipment that can often be overlooked for sharing in research environments. This is where there is the most untapped potential for sharing, in my opinion, on research campuses in this category of less expensive but major research equipment resources. On the topic of freezers, thanks to significant work by Christina when she worked at CU Boulder, CU Green Labs has launched a program about 4 years ago aimed at growing this culture of sharing ultra-low temperature freezers to demonstrate to campus that there are scientists at CU Boulder that want access to cold storage outside the culture of my lab and my ultra-low temperature freezers. We now have 5 freezers in 4 buildings scattered across campus with about 100 users in 6 departments. This has led to approximately $100,000 in avoided freezer purchases, which of course doesn't include other savings such as floor space savings that would have been needed to house the additional ultra temperature freezers, and electricity and ventilation cost savings as well. You can see a picture of 2 of our units here. This has been our most popular site for this shared ultra temperature freezer project. Not long after starting this project, the first freezer we placed in this building filled up quite quickly, and thus we got a second unit for this building. We wanted to encourage scientists to move into the shared ultra temperature freezers, but still have to pay a fee for their space to try to avoid samples going into the freezers that should have really been disposed. So we worked with our campus controller's office to set a very affordable rate and an attractive rate of 25 cents per month for a 2-inch box. This rate is solely based on the cost to replace the ultra temperature freezer in 6 years if rental fees were collected for a full freezer over the 6 years. So this is definitely a very subsidized rate. For example, this rate does not take into consideration other costs such as lab space use, electricity use, and importantly, our time to manage the program. Lab buildings with an interest in having a Green Labs shared ultra temperature freezer for their scientists to easily access have provided a location for the freezer. And labs using the freezers are required to be responsible for their samples if there is an emergency. Thus, there are lab points of contact for each lab on the monitoring system to be notified in an event of a freezer failure. We intend to encourage our researchers to purge samples that they no longer need in the shared ultra temperature freezers, perhaps by having these freezers participate in the freezer challenge itself. It has been interesting to follow the various reasons why researchers are using our ultra temperature freezers. Some really only need minimal space in an ultra temperature freezer and thus want to avoid the cost of a unit. In fact, some researchers will rent space for only 1 box, while other researchers are just starting up their research and don't need an entire ultra temperature freezer yet. Others want a place to house duplicate samples for resiliency in case something happens to their freezer. We've had a couple of labs request space in our freezers because they're collaborating with a colleague in a building which is away from their lab space in another building. We have also had researchers move into our freezers because they've had a freezer failure and decided that they could downsize the volume of their samples to the point where it didn't make sense to buy a replacement freezer for their lab. Collectively, these efforts for efficiency that Christina and I have discussed means being more efficient with research sponsor funding, whether that is federal or from another source. Also, being more efficient with startup package funding, research institution costs, and even company funding as well. If a scientist is writing a grant proposal for funding, why not mention efforts being employed that benefit efficiency, resiliency, and sample integrity in the grant proposal. Why not show that your campus, your research is doing what you can to make the most of the funding and maximize the positive impact of those research dollars? This is what the I2SL Bringing Efficiency to Research Grants, or Better Grants effort is about. This is still a young grassroots effort that I've been leading with partners such as My Green Lab and others as much as I can through the I2SL University Alliance Group when I can make the time. To help increase the focus on this effort, lately we've been trying to find funding through nonprofits that offer grants so we can have a staff member dedicated to this effort. But even without funding, we have been able to at least accomplish so far the creation of an initial Better Grants website. The plan is to launch a campaign to encourage researchers at institutions across the U.S. to start voluntarily incorporating actions for efficiency into grant proposals, such as those ideas encouraged at this Better Grants website. So if you're a scientist that's writing a grant proposal and you agree with the idea of connecting efficiency with the funding of research to maximize the effective use of sponsor funding while also minimizing the environmental footprint, then please do visit this site and see if it can help with including actions for efficiency into your proposal. Send me your feedback so we can make this website even better. And if you're willing to share an example of what you put in your proposal, please do so we can use your effort to encourage others to take action as well. So in summary, the Freezer Challenge is a fun competition between labs and institutions. The challenge engages scientists, which can help lead to more action for efficient storage beyond the challenge, such as the idea of co-localizing units. And efficient cold storage is a win-win, bringing benefits for sample integrity, sample management, funding, resiliency, and the planet. And so I will turn it back to Christina now here.
Yeah, so My Green Lab and I2SL have an announcement that the 2020 Freezer Challenge deadline has been extended to July 1st this year. So even if you're learning about the Freezer Challenge for the first time today, that still means that you have 3 months that you could still take action and complete a score sheet for the challenge. So feel free to visit the website and sign up if you haven't already. And for those of you that are already participating, we don't need your score sheets back until July 1st.
Great. And then I also had another announcement. Is that this webinar is really part of a series of webinars. I2SL is offering the second webinar on May 14th, which you can see here on the slide. Alicia and Sean, who will be doing that webinar, are like Christina and I, they're very active members of the I2SL community. And they'll be speaking about the impact that co-localized shared equipment, like the idea of managed co-localized freezers mentioned in this talk, can have to benefit design and engineering of new and renovated lab buildings. And it's my hope that they can provide you with some real cost examples of cost avoidances in those projects that result from migrating to more of a shared equipment and shared space culture. This webinar is also free, and the registration link is not available yet, but if you email I2SL, they will get you signed up. And so with that, Christina and I will take some time to answer some questions.
Yes.
Thank you, Kathy and Christina, for your informative presentation. And yes, it is time for our live Q&A portion of our webinar. Now, to our audience, if you have any questions you would like to ask, if you haven't done so already, please do so. Just click on that Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen, and we will answer as many of your questions as we have time for. Now, let's get started. We have some great questions coming in. Let's see. Okay, our first question. What have you found to be the biggest stumbling block in adopting the best practices for energy efficient freezer management?
So Christina here. I'll take this first question to start with. So I think the biggest challenge facing labs initially is actually committing the time to undertake these best practices and implement them in the lab. Obviously, you're doing research full time, and busy with other priorities. And so, yeah, devoting time to this, especially to, you know, maybe give your refrigerators and freezers a reboot, you know, doing the defrosting, doing the preventative maintenance, doing a sample clean out, all of that, you know, that does take some effort. But like once you do it, your freezers and refrigerators are running more efficiently, and, you know, you're better protecting your samples. So some strategies for addressing this, you know, if your lab is motivated by competition, signing up for the freezer challenge and making it known that, you know, your lab is doing this, you're competing with other labs worldwide, that can be a motivator for some labs. Other labs have found success in, you know, devoting like one Friday afternoon a month during the freezer challenge or year round to kind of keeping tabs on the preventative maintenance and other best practices we've talked about here. Just setting aside particular time, putting it on people's calendars, and making it a group effort to implement those best practices. So I think time is the biggest issue. Yeah, it can be overcome with someone in the lab to motivate.
Thank you. Now our next question, and I'm going to ask these questions to both of you, so feel free if you both have input for these questions to both chime in. Why does having ice built up in the freezer affect efficiency?
Well, I'll just add here, like, if you have ice around the seal for the freezer, for example, then the freezer will be having trouble sealing and keeping closed, and there could be leakage of air from the freezer, and therefore, you know, that ice buildup can cause the freezer to be leaking air out, and therefore having to work harder to maintain that temperature.
Yeah, and to add to that, this is Christina again. To add to that, you know, freezers aren't designed to be like full of ice. You know, they're not meant to be glaciers in there. So having the proper airflow moving around your sample boxes, I mean, that's how it was intended to function and work. So having all that ice built up makes it less energy efficient.
Thank you both. Now, is running your freezers at negative 70 degrees in line with CAP requirements in a biorepository?
I am not sure on the answer to that question. No, I'm not familiar with that. What question number was that, Christy?
30.
Yeah. I mean, I guess
yeah, I actually don't know about CAP requirements either for biorepositories. You know, my experience hasn't been working in an environment with a biorepository. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, but we can definitely follow up with the person that asked.
Absolutely. And Todd, we do have your email address, so we can have somebody from Brookside Sciences contact you and give you that information. Let's go to our next question. How would you recommend sorting through samples that need to be kept at a low temperature while discarding samples in the same freezer?
Kathy, do you want to share your awesome system at CU Boulder with the mobile freezers?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we don't have this for ultra low temperature freezers, but one thing that we have set up for the scientists at for negative 20 temperatures is that we have a fleet of mobile negative 20 freezers that scientists can borrow, so that they can plug that unit into their lab and use that unit to be going through the samples in their freezers, their minus 20 freezers. Although we have had scientists use these even for ultra lows at times. But we've also helped scientists. The Green Labs program at CU Boulder has helped CU Boulder scientists with finding backup space in ultra low temperature freezers that they can borrow for a while to help make some space in their unit, so that they can then more easily go through the samples within their freezer. So we have a tendency to know what equipment resources in terms of freezers, where they're located on our campus, And so we often get contacted for various needs that our scientists have for their freezers, including cleanouts, and we will help. One thing, like we had one lab recently that is way in a satellite lab that's off campus, and they had 2 ultra-lows, and we did have a lab go through the process to say that they really didn't need an ultra-low anymore. It was still a functioning ultra-low. And so one way that we were able to help that lab in that satellite situation where there were no other ultra-low freezers in the same area was to provide them with this additional ultra-low temperature freezer, which is just being used as a backup. So they can plug it in to be able to do purges, and it also provides them with an emergency backup in time if they were to ever have a failure. But the lab is committed, and we ask them to commit to please keeping it off when not in use, because it is not an energy efficient unit. And so, yeah, that was part of the coordination that we did with them. But we do various things like that example to help out.
I think this is Christina here, just to add to that, ask if you are in a building where there are other labs and other ultra-low temperature freezers, for example, ask around for if anyone has available space, even, a shelf here, a shelf there. And, so perhaps you can clear some samples out of your ultra-low to provide more space while you do this purge of samples. Also, obviously, use, coolers and dry ice, to pull different boxes out of the freezer and look at them in more detail and then put them back in the freezer. So unless you're in a spot where there's absolutely no other ultra-lows around you, I think, leaning on your colleagues and asking around for support is a great way to tackle a sample clean out in an ultra-low.
Thank you. And I wanted to real quick jump back to our question about if running your freezers at -70 degrees if that is in line with CAP requirements in a biorepository. And yes, that is in line with a biorepository. Okay.
Oh.
Let's go to our next question. Yes. Let's see. What are the best defrosting practices? And how do we deal with temporary storage when the freezer is defrosting?
So again, like you will need to find, the equivalent temperature, available in another unit, probably to do a full defrost of, say, an ultra-low or a -20 unit. So hopefully there are some colleagues in your building or at your company that you can support, or your group could look at investing in like a mobile freezer, like what Kathy has at Boulder, to support this sort of effort in, ongoing in the future. In terms of how to defrost, for example, a -20 or an ultra-low, you want to make sure to cut the power to it in whatever, follow the instructions, I guess, in your manual about how to do that properly, because sometimes if you just pull the plug, it'll alarm and, that sort of thing, or it'll affect the battery. So just make sure you're following proper, shutting off procedures for the unit. So once you've cleared out all your samples, turn it off. And the one thing that we have done, a practice that we promote at Boulder, is to do this on a Friday afternoon. You've cleared out your samples, unplug the freezer, prop open the door, and just let it sit all weekend, open, drying out. And sometimes put towels, or even better, cardboard on the floor underneath the door, so that any moisture that's falling out of the freezer will get soaked up in the cardboard, and then you can, that'll dry out again, and you can still recycle it. And then on Monday, you've got a dry freezer that you can, sanitize and turn back on again.
And I'll just add that obviously we have the mobile freezers at CU Boulder for the -20 needs. I mean, this has been very popular among our scientists. They like to borrow our -20 freezers that are on the carts. But then also we've been really trying hard to get backup units when we've had freezers that have been retired that are still working. you know, we keep them unplugged, but when there's a need, such as a defrost, you know, getting these units around campus to locations where they may not have access to such a backup unit, and providing these units as an opportunity for labs in that area to be able to plug that in and do a ultra low temperature freezer defrost, like Christina described. So we've been really trying hard. And so, I mean, knowing on your campus or at your company where backup resources are that you could utilize is a great way, but also to Christina's point, to know, you know, to connect with other researchers that may have space that you could borrow to do this as well.
Thank you both, and that's great advice. And we always want to make sure we want to remove the cardboard also so we don't get any mold.
Yes.
Question? Yes. Our next question, why do you think more researchers do not take advantage of centralized storage resources?
Yeah, I'll take this one. In my opinion, well, at least based upon what I've been working on at CU Boulder to try to move us more in this direction where possible, is that it requires the help and support and coordination from upper levels of the university to eventually get us there. And so if a campus hasn't been thinking in that way yet, from more of a campus-wide approach, it's going to be a bit of a struggle to get there. But if campus has been, if there are people on that campus encouraging, looking at moving in this direction, like I have been at CU Boulder and other people have been at CU Boulder, then that'll help us get over that hurdle to be able to hopefully get there eventually. Because there are, as my presentation hopefully described to you all, that there are really you know, great cost avoidances, efficient use of space, and laboratory space is so expensive. So heading in this direction really does lead to great benefits to research, in my opinion, but also great cost avoidances and better resilience for those units as well.
Thank you. And we have time for a few more questions, but before we continue, I do want to remind our audience that any questions we are unable to answer live today and those that come in during the on-demand period, they will be addressed by our speakers and Brooks Life Sciences via the email address you provided at the time of registration. Okay, let's continue. Can we apply temperature tuning in deep freezer negative 25 Celsius?
Yeah, I saw this this question come in. So because, you know, if you have a unit at negative 25 degrees Celsius, you know, that's obviously a warmer temperature than negative 70 or negative 80. And I don't know if temperature tuning is the right term, if you would want to change that temperature on your unit. But one thing that I think you should consider is that other best practice I was talking about in this area, which is to consider whether all the samples in your negative 25 degree unit actually need to be there. I think that's the best option as opposed to like changing the set point of your freezer. So determine if everything needs to be that cold or if some things could be warmed up to refrigerator temperatures. I think that's the best solution. I haven't really heard of people changing the temperatures of their negative 20s or negative 25 units for energy efficiency purposes.
We have, though, at CU Boulder, there have been labs that have had like negative 40 units that have increased the temperature to negative 30 or even negative 25. So we have had some labs do temperature tuning even at these different freezer temperatures. And at least 2 of those units, we did metering before and after, and there was good energy savings. And these are like lab grade units. So they were, they did have a larger footprint than maybe a residential one, obviously. But yeah, so we have seen energy savings also at these other temperatures to do temperature tuning.
Now, is there a universal method of measuring the improved energy efficiency? Well,
at CU Boulder, we've been lucky to work with our electrical engineers on campus to set up a process that we use to do metering of the actual unit. So we've mainly just been doing metering before and after the temperature change, and just using that to compare the difference. We do have a website or web page on the Green Labs web page that is specific to -70 efforts. I didn't include a link in the resources to that, but it does, like the slide in Christina's talk that showed the change in consumption. And I assume, Christina, that in that report, that would have been from metering before and after. We've also done metering before and after, and so have a number of institutions, and we've been adding their data to that. Actually, there's 2 pages. Those 2 pages, on -70 efforts, and so we've been collecting that in that location as the data that supports the idea that temperature tuning does lead to energy savings.
For the SEAL market assessments that have been done, so the Center for Energy Efficient Laboratories, My Green Lab is part of that partnership that does these reports. There have been 3 or 4 reports that have come out so far, and they're all on the My Green Lab website under the SEAL program if you want to take a look. But for the one that was influential in getting Energy Star ratings for laboratory grade refrigerators and freezers, there was definitely like a standardized Energy Star approved procedure for measuring the energy efficiency of those units, both at -70 and -80 degrees Celsius, which is how we got the data on this slide that you see here. So I believe there are like test method details in the SEAL market assessment on ultra low temperature freezers. So if you wanted to mimic those, those are publicly available.
Thank you. And because we're speaking of efficiency here, could you please remind us how much energy does a freezer actually use?
So I would say that, it definitely varies based on the make and model and even the age of the freezer. So refrigerators often consume 1 to 2 to 3 kilowatt hours per day. They're pretty minimal compared to ultra lows. The same for -20 units. You can have -20s that consume about 2 kilowatt hours per day. You can also have some that consume a lot more for a variety of reasons. Whether that is they're not maintained properly, they are totally iced over, maybe they're super empty inside. For whatever reason, there are, at Boulder, and I did some of the metering at Boulder when I worked there. For some reason, some of those units consume a lot more than the norm for that category. Ultra low temperature freezers, though, the ones that are Energy Star rated consume from like 8 to, I don't know what the upper range actually is for what has Energy Star, but I would say like 8 to 12 kilowatt hours per day is pretty good for an ultra low temperature freezer. But at CU Boulder and, for the SEAL market assessment, they did meter some that were consuming 25 or 30 or even more kilowatt hours per day. So there's a wide range, and but yeah, the Energy Star approved ultra low temperature freezers are all going to be kind of in the same ballpark in terms of energy efficiency.
Yeah, so if I could add to that, the residential like units for -20, we've seen that, like Christina was saying, about 2 kilowatt hours per day. But there are lab grade units that will consume more. But luckily, we do now have Energy Star for those units, so that's great, because some of the metering that the CU Green Labs program did before the Energy Star effort, I mean, we metered some -20 lab grade units that were used. One of them used, I remember, 13 kilowatt hours per day, and that was kind of an extreme example. But I was shocked, and I was like, wow, we have some ultra lows on campus that are using less than this -20. We've also metered like chromatography refrigerators, And, all of these units, there's a range from our metering results. And by the way, we make our metering results public. So it's up on our website. There's a link to this data that we've been metering, because some campuses haven't been able to have the opportunity to do metering on their campus, so they can have access to our data to justify projects and so forth. But like chromatography refrigerators, I mean, we were metering some at like 10 kilowatt hours per day or 12 kilowatt hours per day. So they were quite consumptive. But, this is a lot of this data that I'm mentioning, where we have these really energy consumptive units, was happening before the Energy Star effort came along. And I would say that's really moving the market. There wasn't as much attention to energy efficiency for lab grade units, whether that was lab grade refrigerators, lab grade freezers, even chromatography refrigerators. There wasn't this attention to it, but the market has really been shifting, and there is more and more attention to this now. And so we're now, if you were to meter, you might find a unit that's older, but you also might that's older and was around before the Energy Star efforts, or there still will be ones coming on campus that haven't gotten Energy Star or work to reduce that consumption. But in general, we're seeing just so many more companies that are putting products out there, paying attention to this, and really working on the energy efficiency of the unit. So it's just really positive. It's great to see. It's really makes me happy.
Very good. Thank you for that detailed answer. Now, our next question, and I'm sure this question could come in from multiple attendees. What do you do if your lab has the habit of hoarding? I work in a medchem lab, and we keep compounds, buffers, and solutions in our cold storage units. There are some things that are not labeled, but for the rest, how can we communicate this to our PIs, since the hoarding culture comes from before most of us got to the lab?
Well, go ahead. Do you want me to answer, Christina?
Go ahead, Kathy.
I was just going to say, this question kind of reminds me too of the questions that I've typically gotten with the Green Labs program is, what do you do when a lab doesn't want to be engaged in your program? And to be honest, there's been so many labs that have wanted to do this. I've been so impressed with our scientists. And I hear similar things of other campuses. There's so many labs that want to do this that I focus on those that want to be engaged, and that eventually those positive examples can influence the culture in other labs that maybe haven't been as engaged to do that, because it moves from just being a couple of labs doing this to more and more labs doing this, to becoming something that the department's doing, and that culture moves along. And so I don't know, within a particular lab, though, I mean, if you're a member of that lab, that's hard. But setting that example, maybe just as one person in the lab, and sharing what you're doing to be efficient, and then seeing if there's another person that is also willing to do their part to be efficient, and seeing if you can grow that culture internally within the lab over time. As I mentioned, culture shifts can take time. So, if there's efforts like that you can do. I have seen on my campus just labs that really in the beginning would avoid, me when I walk down the hall. But that with the cultural shift within the building, and that over time, those labs have turned into some of our most engaged labs. So this culture shift is slow. It takes time. It's a building process, and building through examples, I think, is a good way to try to move that. And I hope that answered your question. Christina, I don't know if you have anything to add. I mean, you were so important in our program.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is, if you're in a lab that is hoarding reagents, samples in cold storage units, I think maybe approaching that issue in your laboratory from the perspective of, I'm unable to be effective as a scientist because I say, there's a lot of stuff in the freezer that I don't know what it is, or the refrigerator, whatever it might be. There's a lot of stuff that I don't know what it is, and I have to dig through it to get my own stuff. We're leaving the door open. If you frame it from like a resiliency standpoint, that might get through to your PI a little bit better. Another idea is, to talk with them about cost. So, if your lab is hoarding stuff and things are really full, you could share that, like, instead of buying another unit, which will cost $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 and be a significant expense for the lab, if you all just took some time to kind of sort through what you have, might be able to free up space and eliminate that costs that will be coming down the line if your lab doesn't take action with their cold storage. So those are just a couple ideas too. If you need to frame it differently to appeal to what's important to your PI, obviously, trying to be energy efficient is great, and doing your best on that front, but that doesn't always speak to everybody. So trying to frame it in a different way might help.
Thank you both so much for this excellent Q&A session. We are out of time, and we had a significant amount of questions that we are unable to answer during this live event. But I just do want to remind our audience that those questions we didn't answer and those that come in during the on-demand period, they will be addressed by our speakers and our team at Brooks Life Sciences via the email address you provided at the time of registration. I would like to once again thank Dr. Kathryn Ramirez-Aguilar and Christina Greever for their time today and their important contribution to reducing the environmental footprint of freezer use and research. Do either of you have any final comments for our audience?
Well, yeah, I really appreciate it.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Christina. Go ahead.
No, that's okay.
Go ahead. Okay. We have worked together so closely for so long.
I know. So Christina here with My Green Lab, and I just want to, mention if you do have any, follow-up questions that you didn't get in, you can submit them and we'll answer them during the on-demand period for the webinar. Please visit the My Green Lab website. If you're curious more about what we do, we have many different programs. The Freezer Challenge is just one of them, like the lab certification I mentioned. We do some work on green chemistry, the ACT label, which is all about sustainable procurement. So we have a lot to offer. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter and on our website, and then we're also on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So, and I manage that social media. So if you interact with us, you're interacting with me for the most part, and that'd be really great moving forward. And thanks again, everybody, for listening in on this.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank everyone as well for listening in. Working on efficient cold storage has been so rewarding at CU Boulder, and I hope that you'll find the same on your campus. And if you're interested in more, you can visit the CU Green Labs page. And we have lots of resources on freezers and many other efforts as well. And I also encourage you to attend the I2SL conference in Chicago in October. So it's really a fun and grassroots in many ways experience. And so just there's so much passion around sustainability in labs. I just love going every year and hearing about all the great efforts that people are doing. And one of the nicest things about I2SL conference is that you're getting such a diverse range of stakeholders attending. I mean, it includes engineers, designers, architects, but also safety folks and individuals like Christina and I working with scientists, and also scientists sometimes come as well. So I encourage you to attend and share what you're doing.
Thank you both. And thank you to Labyrinth and our sponsor, Brooks Life Sciences, for underwriting today's educational webcast. If you are interested in receiving your continuing education credits, please click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located at the top right of your presentation window and follow the process to obtain your credits. This webcast can be viewed on demand, and you may continue to submit questions during the on-demand period. Labyrinth will alert you via email when today's presentation is available for replay, and we encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. That's all for now, and we hope to see you again soon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a great day.